Hoa tried to charge me for too many cars, didn't know I controlled the entire neighborhood. It all started on a typical Tuesday morning. Mark Thompson, a hard-working contractor, walked out of his front door to grab the mail. As he reached the mailbox, his eyes landed on a bright orange notice taped to his door. His heart sank as he tore it open, reading the bold, glaring letters. It was from the Homeowners Association, led by none other than Karen Mitchell, the infamous president who ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. The letter accused him of violating the HOA's rules by parking too many vehicles in his driveway, specifically citing his work truck, his wife Sarah's SUV, and a car they recently bought for their daughter's 16th birthday. The fee increase was steep, $500 a month. Mark felt his hands shake with a mix of anger and disbelief. This was the third time this week Karen had targeted him, all over something so trivial. Mark leaned against his mailbox, watching Karen stroll down the street, clipboard in hand, inspecting the neighborhood like she was a self-appointed queen. He could see her stop at his driveway and begin snapping photos, her eyes never leaving the camera as she scrutinized his vehicles. Not again, Mark muttered under his breath. His wife, Sarah, peeked out the window and called to him. "Is she out there again?" Mark's jaw clenched as he turned to face her. "Yes. And this time she's crossed the line. It wasn't just about the cars anymore." Mark knew it was time to show Karen who truly held the power in the neighborhood. While Karen Mitchell paraded around the neighborhood with her clipboard, enforcing every rule she could, Mark Thompson had quietly been playing the long game. For the past 5 years, he'd been buying up properties in the development, using his real estate investment company, Sunrise Properties. One by one, houses had gone up for sale, and Mark was ready to pounce. Each property was bought through different LLCs, hiding his true involvement from both the neighbors and the Hoa. At first, Mark had treated it like a savvy business move, an investment to secure his future. But as Karen's grip on the community tightened, as she fined families for the most trivial offenses and imposed ridiculous rules, his motives had shifted. What started as an opportunity to build wealth had turned into a strategy to take back control of the neighborhood from a power-hungry Hoa president. Mark walked into his office that morning, the weight of the situation settling in. He pulled out the latest property maps, his eyes scanning over the neighborhood's boundaries. Every lot was carefully highlighted, coded with a different color for each property he owned. The most recent purchase had just gone through, pushing him closer to his goal. He'd now quietly accumulated 67% of the properties in the community, a majority that would give him control of the Hoa itself. As Mark checked his phone, a message popped up from his lawyer. "Property closing complete. You now own 67% of the development." A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he tucked the phone away. He wasn't just another homeowner anymore, he was the majority shareholder in the community. And Karen was about to learn exactly what that meant. The tension was thick when Mark entered the community center that night. The room was packed with neighbors, all seated shoulder to shoulder, their eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. The emergency Hoa meeting had been called by Karen Mitchell, and everyone knew it was about to get ugly. Karen stood at the front, poised with a microphone in hand, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the podium as she prepared to present her case. She flashed a quick smile at the crowd before launching into her attack. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began, her voice oozing with false sweetness. "As you can see, Mr. Thompson's property has become a nuisance to this community. I've gathered professional photos of his driveway, showing multiple vehicles crowding his space. This is a violation of our Hoa rules. And it's affecting property values. She clicked through slides on her PowerPoint, showing pictures of Mark's driveway with his work truck, Sarah's SUV, and the Honda they'd recently bought for their daughter. The room murmured in agreement. But Mark kept his gaze fixed on Karen. His jaw clenched. But he remained calm, letting her finish her presentation. She continued to rattle off statistics, weather reports about snowdrifts, and even anonymous complaints from neighbors. She then pulled out a thick binder, documenting every instance of cars coming and going from Mark's property over the past 3 months. Mark's blood began to boil as he realized the extent of Karen's surveillance. She'd been tracking his every move. She's gone too far, Mark thought. But he waited patiently, letting the room absorb Karen's accusations. When she finally finished, Mark stood up slowly. His voice rang out with authority as he spoke. Before we vote on these new rules, I believe it's important to review the current property ownership structure of this neighborhood. The room fell silent. Karen's confident smile faltered slightly as Mark made his way to the front of the room, a stack of papers in hand. He pulled out a detailed property map of the entire development, spreading it out for everyone to see. Over the past 5 years, Sunrise Properties, my real estate company, has been acquiring homes in this neighborhood. And I now own 67% of the properties here. The shock was palpable. The room erupted into whispers, and Karen's face turned pale as she realized what was happening. What do you mean? 67%. She stammered. Mark continued, unfazed. This means that I am now the majority shareholder of this Hoa. And I believe it's time we have a conversation about how this Hoa has been run. Karen's hands trembled as she grabbed for her water bottle. But she was too late. Mark wasn't done yet. But before we talk about ownership, perhaps we should discuss your selective enforcement. Let's take a look at these surveillance photos you've been collecting of my driveway, he said, pulling up images on the projector. Here, Karen is measuring my grass at 3 a.m., but completely ignoring other properties with much worse violations. The room buzzed with murmurs as Mark laid out his case, showing how Karen had used her position to harass residents while giving preferential treatment to her friends. It was clear, Karen had been abusing her power for years. And Mark had the proof to back it up. The room grew heavy with tension as Mark revealed more and more of Karen's illegal actions. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's increasingly flustered expressions. She could feel the walls closing in around her as Mark continued to unravel the web of deceit she had spun over the years. Let's talk about something more concerning than my cars, Mark said, his voice steady as he clicked to the next slide. Surveillance. Karen has been tracking the movements of residents without their knowledge. Here's footage from my security cameras, showing her at 3 a.m. measuring the grass on my lawn. And here's another photo of her taking close-up shots of my cars, as if she were trying to build a case against me. Gasps rippled through the room as the images flashed on the screen. People exchanged uncomfortable glances, some starting to shift in their seats. They had no idea the extent of Karen's surveillance. Mark wasn't finished. He pulled out a stack of financial documents. Karen has also been funneling Hoa funds into her own personal projects. This renovation of the community pool, the $50,000 that mysteriously disappeared. There's no record of any pool improvements. But I do have a bank transfer showing that money went straight into Karen's personal account. The room fell silent. Even Karen's loyal followers couldn't hide the doubt creeping into their expressions. Mark's lawyer, sitting quietly in the back, nodded approvingly at the evidence being presented. And just as the atmosphere reached its boiling point, a sound from outside grew louder. A news van had arrived. The reporters, cameras in hand, were setting up just outside the community center. Mark had invited them earlier, knowing this was going to be a pivotal moment. As Karen noticed the reporters filing in, her face went pale. She could no longer control the narrative. The truth was finally getting out, and there was no way she could hide behind her lies any longer. Mark didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled and continued. "Oh. And here's the kicker," he said, pulling out more documents. "These emails show Karen bragging about using her position to keep certain undesirable families out of this neighborhood. She's used our Hoa fees to fund her personal vacations to Hawaii and to pay for favors to her friends." The reporters were already scribbling notes, their cameras capturing every moment. The entire room had turned against Karen, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She tried to regain control, slamming her hand on the podium. "This is a lie. It's all lies," she shouted. But her voice trembled. No one was listening anymore. Mark turned to face the crowd, his expression unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us here. We've all been victims of Karen's abuse of power. And now, it's time for change." The murmurs in the room grew louder. And as Karen desperately tried to restore order, it was clear that the tide had turned. People were starting to see Karen for who she really was, someone who had manipulated and controlled their community for her own gain. The local news cameras were rolling, ensuring that this moment would be forever documented. The courtroom was packed when Karen walked in, flanked by her high-priced lawyer, her head held high despite the storm brewing around her. She still wore that same smug expression, the one that had made her the queen of the neighborhood for years. But Mark wasn't fazed. He sat calmly beside his lawyer, ready for the fight of his life. As the trial began, Mark's lawyer wasted no time. "Your Honor, we have ample evidence that Karen Mitchell has abused her position as Hoa president for years. Let's start with her mismanagement of Hoa funds." The lawyer presented copies of bank records, showing how Karen had used the association's money to fund personal expenses. The $50,000 allocated for the pool renovation, it had disappeared into Karen's personal account. There were also receipts for trips to Hawaii, paid for using Hoa fees, while residents in the neighborhood were penalized for minor infractions. Karen's lawyer tried to argue, but it was clear the evidence was mounting against her. The judge listened intently as Mark's lawyer presented more evidence, emails from Karen herself, bragging about her ability to manipulate the Hoa board and control the neighborhood through discriminatory enforcement. There were emails detailing how she had deliberately targeted specific residents, using the HOA's power to push out families she deemed undesirable. A photo flashed up on the screen, Karen smiling with a cocktail in hand. Captioned, "Thanks to all my rule-breaking neighbors for funding this vacation." A hushed silence fell over the courtroom as the magnitude of her actions sank in. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she couldn't escape the truth. Mark's lawyer moved to the final point. "We also have undeniable evidence of her mistreatment of certain families. Mrs. Johnson, a resident over 20 years, was fined for the most trivial reasons. While Karen's friends were given free passes for the same offenses, Karen shot up in her seat, her face turning bright red as she shouted, "This is an attack on me. They're trying to destroy everything I've worked for." But no one was listening anymore. The evidence was too overwhelming. The judge, a man known for his no-nonsense approach, finally spoke. "Karen Mitchell, you've been found guilty of abuse of power, misappropriation of Hoa funds, and discriminatory practices. Not only will you be forced to repay every penny you have illegally collected in fees, but you will also be removed from your position as Hoa president. A full audit will be conducted on the HOA's finances, and we will move forward with a new board." Karen's face drained of color as the reality of her fall from grace hit her. She had spent years ruling the neighborhood with fear, only to have it all come crashing down. Her lawyer tried to mount one last defense, but it was futile. Karen was done. As she left the courtroom, defeated, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. This wasn't just about one woman, it was about the community reclaiming their power. He turned to the crowd, many of whom had been there to witness the trial, and announced, "We'll be forming a new Hoa board. One that represents everyone. No more special treatment for Karen's friends. No more abusive fines. We're going to make this neighborhood a place where we all feel safe, respected, and valued." With Karen Mitchell's resignation, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. The oppressive weight that had hung over every homeowner, the constant fear of fines and surveillance, evaporated almost overnight. As Mark assumed a more active role in the newly formed Hoa, things began to change for the better. The very first vote of the new board was to establish clear, fair rules for all residents, ensuring that no one would be singled out or bullied again. The changes were not only welcomed, they were celebrated. The first noticeable shift was the relaxed parking situation. Mark had fought for families to park as many vehicles as they needed, as long as they fit within their own driveway. Gone were the days of Karen's arbitrary restrictions on the number of cars allowed. Now, people could park without fear of receiving a fine for having an extra vehicle. Next, there was a push for the community to grow together. Literally. The new Hoa encouraged gardening, something that had been discouraged under Karen's reign. People began planting flowers, vegetables, and trees in their yards without fear of receiving violation notices. The community garden, started in a once unused lot, became a central gathering point for neighbors. It wasn't just about growing food, it was about growing friendships, property values, once stifled by Karen's harsh rule and reputation, began to rise. With the threat of unreasonable fines gone, families were now willing to invest in their homes and their futures. New families moved in, attracted by the changes and the newfound sense of unity. The atmosphere was welcoming. And soon, Mark found himself surrounded by neighbors who were eager to make their community a better place. Mark was humbled by the transformation. He didn't want to take credit, but he knew that his decision to challenge Karen had been the spark that ignited this revolution. As the new Hoa president, he worked hard to ensure that every voice was heard, that every neighbor felt valued, and that no one would ever have to endure the fear and oppression that had once ruled their lives. 3 weeks after Karen's departure, Mark stood in front of his home, watching as his daughter pulled into the driveway in her Honda. Beside her was Mark's work truck and Sarah's SUV. It wasn't just the cars that brought a smile to Mark's face, it was the realization that they were no longer hiding anything. They were living freely, as they should. As a family, they had reclaimed their space, their peace, and their neighborhood. From the driveway, Mark could see neighbors laughing and chatting across the street. Kids running around in yards that had once been off-limits for play. The transformation was more than just structural, it was a complete change in the community's heart and spirit. Mark had helped bring about a new era. One where respect, fairness, and unity were the core of every decision. A few days later, Mark received a call from a TV producer who had seen the coverage of the community's turnaround. They wanted to do a documentary on how the Hoa had been transformed from a place of fear into a model of cooperation and respect. As Mark looked out the window at the thriving neighborhood, he couldn't help but smile. His fight had been worth it. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about giving his community a future. And as he looked at the glowing faces of his neighbors, Mark knew this was only the beginning. The best part. The neighborhood's property values had gone up 15% in the first month after Karen left. People were finally living where they were treated with respect. And that was worth more than any amount of money. And that's how Mark Thompson and his neighborhood took back control from the corrupt Hoa president. Karen Mitchell. It's amazing what can happen when a community comes together, fights for what's right, and stands up to injustice. What do you think about this story? Do you think Mark did the right thing by taking on the Hoa? Or do you have a different perspective? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear your opinions. And if you want to hear more incredible tales of Hoa drama, power struggles, and victories like this one, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thanks for tuning in. And I'll see you next time with more stories that prove, sometimes, standing up for yourself can change everything.